Thanks for tuning into the Football Talk Squadron. I'm Dutch.
And I'm Maul.
And he's back.
I'm back again.
We'll start it off. You know, this is going to be our college episode. We'll get Maul's hot takes, just sort of like where the committee ranked teams, just sort of the feel of not just the rankings, but sort of where we're at in college football, who we think is going to be there at the end. But before we get into that, we'll do past and present first. So do you want past or do you want present first?
Let's do present first.
Okay, present is going to be guess the college. So
okay.
I asked you if you knew him before the podcast started just to see if you knew who he was.
I should have looked it up.
Devin Singletary. So he had a really good game, filled in for Dameon Pierce with the Texans this week and went off. And we'll get into that in a minute with the NFL episode of the Texans, but I thought it was a good long shot player.
Devin Singletary. I want to say, kind of give myself some hints. Like it's a Power 5 conference.
No.
Ooh, no. Okay. I was thinking like a Kansas State or like an Oklahoma State or something like that. I know that's not right, but I was thinking like those kinds of levels of teams where it's just like mid-level of a big conference. All right, give me a conference then, so a hint, because I really don't know.
It's not Power 5. I don't even know what conference they're in.
Oh, you don't?
So I'll give you this hint. I don't want to name the coach's name, or else that will give it away. But played for probably one of the best offensive minds in college football.
Currently or like of all time? Is he still coaching?
Still coaching.
In college?
I'd probably say of all time, yeah. In college.
Florida International?
Yeah. Well, it's not international.
Florida Atlantic.
Florida Atlantic with Lane Kiffin. FAU.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. When you said that, I was thinking Lane Kiffin. I was trying to go through the non-Power 5, and it was FAU.
Well, that was going to be my hint, was, hey, he was Lane Kiffin product, but then when you were like, it's not Power 5, I was like, well, there's only one other school that you could have named after that. But, you know, he's a good player, Florida Atlantic. It's one of those teams that you just sort of sit back and you forget about them until they have a good coach, and then after he leaves, you forget about him again.
Yep.
But now I was pretty excited when I found this one because I think this one's a good past.
Okay.
It's a tricky guy because of the teams, but we'll see if you can get it. School's Michigan.
Okay.
Played for the Redskins, then the Jaguars, the Packers, the Raiders, and the Lions.
All right,
so Michigan, Redskins.
Drafted by the Redskins?
Okay. Jaguars, Packers, Raiders, Lions. You want the draft year?
Yeah, give me the year.
1992. He was a first-round pick, number 4 overall.
First-round pick, number 4 overall.
Yep.
Michigan to the Redskins.
So here's your first hint. The Redskins and the second team that I named,
Jags.
The Jags, you don't remember him. You only remember one of these teams.
All right,
guaranteed.
Give them to me again. Redskins, Jags, Raiders.
Redskins, Jags, Packers, Raiders, Lions.
Sounds defensive.
It's not.
It's not defensive.
Not defensive.
Greg Jennings?
Nope. Greg Jennings was, I believe, Western Michigan. I have to look that up. I'm pretty sure he was Western Michigan. But Greg Jennings that's years later. This is 19.
Yeah.
Came out in the draft in 1992.
Is he a receiver?
Yes, but not known for that.
Ooh. Desmond Howard?
Yeah, that was good. The next hit was going to be Super Bowl MVP. He won 2 really big awards.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like Desmond Howard, when he won the Heisman, like there was so much hype that Desmond was going to be like this guy. The other hint, I was tempted, it was going to be like he's probably one of the like most iconic like sports shows in history with Game Day.
Yeah.
But the only reason I found that is they were showing some Desmond Howard highlights and they showed him with the Redskins, and I was like, Desmond Howard played. I thought he was like just straight out went to the Packers, and that's where. No, like the league had pretty much written him off, and he almost got cut by the Packers.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't know a lot of NFL highlights from Desmond Howard.
There's only one. It's the Super Bowl kick. Like, he won Super Bowl MVP with the Packers because he took that kickoff back.
I feel like that's how he won the Heisman too.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that, and he played for Michigan. It was in Michigan's heyday, which, I mean, talk about a way that's a whole nother thing that we can sort of embark on, of like Heisman voting, sort of where the Heisman stands right now. Because
that's kind of, I mean, from back to Desmond Howard, like, that's kind of weird though. Like, two, I mean, iconic plays, and for a player that, like, as much as I don't know how you, but like I said, like, I can't really give you a whole lot of Desmond Howard highlights other than like those two plays, like two very significant, like, will live in history type of plays from a player who was like, from a career standpoint,
the Heisman pose and the Super Bowl kickoff. Like, outside of that, you sit back and you go, "What did Desmond Howard do again?" Like, I think more people recognize him from game day.
Probably.
Like, if you put him out there and go, "Who did he get drafted by?" If you told people that he was the 4th overall pick, like, people would be like, "There's no way."
It's funny. Like, again, how iconic it is in my mind. Like, I used to play the NCAA football game growing up. Like, I liked that more than Madden.
Yeah.
And there was one year, it was probably like in the 2000s, but it was like real big in like the Heisman thing. And like they had like a clip of like all the former Heismans, and that one of like Desmond Howard doing his thing. And I'll tell you, I mean, because that was like when we were little kids, and I remember growing up thinking that like Desmond Howard like created that pose. Like they did the Heisman in that because Desmond Howard did that one time when he, like, that's how I thought it was, like, growing up. Obviously I learned later, but like I remember thinking, and like that's how significant that Michigan return was.
Yeah. I mean, it was huge.
But that's funny.
I wanted to bring this up because it's now that you're talking about that, when I do that like Heisman Saturday every single Saturday, I saw something about that whole pose. The pose, I believe, was after Doak Walker, if I remember right. I'm taking a look real quick. No, it's modeled after Ed Smith, a leading player in 1994 in the defunct New York University football team. So just some random Joe Schmo. Got the trophy design. I mean, I will say, like, of the trophies, you have to give it to, like, I will say the NC, as much as I like the crystal ball, I really like this, like, gold. I don't know what it, at first I thought, man, that trophy's ugly. But then you hold up this huge trophy, like at the end of the national championship, you're like, you know what? That's a great trophy. I don't think anything tops the Super Bowl trophy, but it's better than that glass football that they used to have.
I like the Heisman.
The Heisman's a dope trophy.
Yeah,
like,
so cool.
That one's, that lives forever. But to the college football, you've been out for a few weeks. You've got a few. We're recording this on Monday, so the rankings haven't come out. We'll sort of get into like how we think the rankings should go. I'll pull it up real quick on the computer just to sort of give what the current rankings are. That way we have a little bit of like background, but just sort of what's your take so far?
Yeah, I mean, not to beat a dead horse, because I've seen the rants that you've been going on, but I mean, just the inconsistencies that the committee continues to put, week in and week out as far as how they're ranking teams, it's just infuriating, and it's impossible to follow. They give passes to certain teams when then they use the exact same logic in a reverse roundabout way to say why another team shouldn't be ranked or vice versa. And it's really infuriating. And I know at this point, kind of really the only top 6, maybe top 7 or 8 matter. But and you've talked about it as far as like, why do we even rank the top 25? Like the back end of the rankings it's just a joke. And I think you talked about this on one of your episodes, but again, from a USC fan looking into the rankings. Now I know we have 4 losses, and I'm not trying to like validate why they should be ranked. But when you have a team like Arizona ranked number 21, and you look, okay, well, why would they be ranked and USC be not? They both have 3 losses. USC's 3 losses all came to ranked teams, whereas Arizona's didn't come to all ranked teams. And guess what? One of Arizona's losses were to USC, right?
Yeah.
So how can you tell me that you have 2 teams that play in the same conference, so very similar opponents, with the exact same record, and one team beat the other team, but that team's ranked higher? Like, That doesn't make any sense.
And they didn't do that for other teams. Like you got Texas, Alabama. They put Texas ahead. They have Oklahoma State. They put Oklahoma State ahead.
Yeah,
It's
it's impossible to follow, right? Because they put out these this is how we base the teams. But at the end of the day, they don't even follow those rules. They simply just go, which teams do we like, right? Like I don't know for a fact, but I can almost guarantee that there's some Ohio State homer on the committee that just bullies everybody else into Ohio State would make good TV or something like that. And I'm not taking away from Ohio State, but again, it just the way they give these teams passes based on just of who they are. And we talked about this before. If you took a resume of two teams and you didn't know who they were and you were like, this team has done this and this team has done that, but it's a very different.
Well, I think the example you gave is great. If you took a team that was undefeated, but they played no one ranked, not a single team ranked, and then you took another team and every single game they played a ranked opponent, but they have 3 losses. It's who are you putting on that side?
And I guarantee you, if you gave that to the committee, the only way that they could actually give you a good answer is they'd go, well, who are the teams, right?
Yes.
If it was Ohio State over here
with 3 losses,
or I think if it was Ohio State in either one, right? If it was Air Force versus Ohio State, they'd be like, oh, well, Ohio State's played, a tough team. They've had a good record and they've only lost 3. That means they've beat 7 ranked opponents. They would give them the edge. But if they were undefeated and this was Air Force, they'd be like, oh, Air Force has 3 losses. You're nobody. But look, Ohio State's undefeated. They have these favorites and they would put them in these rankings kind of regardless of their records or where they should be ranked based off of their own rules, and they just decide when they're going to apply those rules to whatever given favorite they have that year.
Well, something else that you mentioned earlier when we were downstairs talking is the recency losses. That's what it kills teams, and it shouldn't really matter when you lost.
It shouldn't.
A loss is a loss.
Alabama's a great example, right? Alabama, luckily, their loss to Texas was really early in the year, right? Because if they happen to, let's say they played Texas yesterday or 2 days ago, and that was their loss, no chance. Alabama's out of it. Right? They're done probably, right? And that doesn't make any sense. Why does when the loss happen determine whether or not you should be ranked?
What's interesting, it hurts some teams, but in Alabama's case, it's sort of hurting them that they played early, and lost. I think when you take a look, and I get that I'm a Bama fan saying this, but you take a look at just sort of the recency. You look at how Texas has performed. They got Quentin Ewers back last game and struggled against a TCU team that everyone would say is a really bad football team. TCU's not the TCU of last year. They got beat by Colorado. Ever since that happened, they are not the same team, but Texas still had them because of that loss. And I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that as the season has gone on, I think that if you sit back and go, hey, if you put them back on the same field, who wins that game? People are like, hey, Bama's probably going to take it round 2.
No, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, you put anybody on the field with Bama 10 times in a row, and they're probably not going out with a better than 50% record, right? Yeah. The problem is, and again, we've talked about this before, is we do rankings so early, and that rankings change consistently throughout the season. Again, the committee and the AP poll, I mean, everybody does it. Excuse me. They'll use, and I feel like it's if you want to pick one way or the other, it's fine, but we need to stay consistent with it. Do we care about when you played that team, what was their ranking? Or should we look at the entire body of work, which the committee says they do, but they don't. They just lie and say that. Should we look at the entire body of work and then decide, right? The fact that we do these rankings so early, it puts this bias in our head of we beat Notre Dame when they were a top 10 team or, whatever it is. But then Notre Dame struggles throughout the rest of the season. And then Notre Dame falls out of the rankings, or USC falls out of the rankings. And then it's now that loss doesn't look so good, or no, that win doesn't look so good. But then you won't apply that logic back to this team, right?
And that
Ohio State is a perfect example, right? Because when they played them, Notre Dame was ranked. When Penn State was up there, they use these as see, this is why, because we beat these teams. Well, then it's but by the time at the end of the year falls around, are those two teams as good as we thought they were then? And it usually is never the case. The football teams evolve and they change, and people, most of the teams play their tougher parts of the schedule at the end of the year, right? So, like, in my opinion, we need to, like, have all these rankings just gone. Let everybody play their schedules throughout with no bias of who's who at the time, and then kind of realize at the end, hey, Florida State beating LSU. Now, LSU has kind of come back and looked a little bit better, but at the time, it was a huge win for Florida State. Middle of the season, we're like, maybe that wasn't as good of a win for Florida State as we thought. And now, again, it comes back and we're like, okay, but like you have to wait until the body of work gets played out before you judge these teams. And my two-team example, and again, I'm not calling for a USC ranking or that we even deserve to be in the discussion for a college playoff. It's just I'm a USC fan, so I look at that the most closely. But that's like my comparison, right? Look at USC's losses. And again, if you mention to anybody that USC should be ranked, they'll laugh at you. Why? Because they're influenced by this bias. But look at their losses. Notre Dame, which that was an absolute dog water game. We sucked that game, and we got blown out and outcoached. No doubt in my mind. That was a bad loss. But look at the other ones. Utah.
2-point loss.
2-point loss. Washington and Oregon, who are the number 5 and number 6 team in the nation right now, within one score. Like, that's a good resume. Again, I'm not saying we should be ranked or even considered because we lost all of those games, but we played those teams tough, right? But then you're
being punished for playing a harder schedule.
Yeah, and but then you're gonna have teams like Iowa who can't score more than 10 points in a game, or Arizona, a team that we beat that are ranked higher than us.
That struggle with Colorado.
It's absolutely silly. These rankings, like, they don't make any sense.
100%. And the thing, I sit back, you talked about that same team, like with Ohio State is uplifted in the rankings because they played Notre Dame, because it's one of their key wins, that Penn State. But then you have a team like Louisville, which I get, they have a bad loss to Pitt, but they beat Notre Dame too. But I literally read an article on ESPN by that Heather Dinich girl who drives me crazy because she speaks out of both ends of her mouth. She's like, well, Ohio State's got these 2 key victories. Louisville, they played Notre Dame, they won, but Notre Dame's not, like, sit back.
They'll go like, oh, Notre Dame's not that good of a team, so it shouldn't boost Louisville.
Yes.
But then they'll go, oh, but Ohio State beat Notre Dame, so look how good they are. Like, they use it against both sides. It's the inconsistencies that I'm talking about.
And we did the same, like, the argument that's happening this year is the exact same thing that happened last year. And I think we talked about at the beginning of the episode, and here we are. Like, I'm so interested to see what they do with Penn State. Because Penn State, like, you're being rewarded for losing to 2 teams in your conference every single year.
And this isn't a shot at Penn State, but, like, this is Penn State every single year.
Yes.
I mean, like, as far back as I can remember, and I know they've had good seasons, and I don't want to take away, I'm not a huge Penn State fan, so I don't know all of their seasons, and I know there's going to be some guys out there that hate on it, but, like, Penn State is literally just a resume booster for Ohio State and Michigan every single year.
And if you want to argue against that, James Franklin is 4-16 as the head coach of Penn State against Michigan and Ohio State combined.
But they get to be used as this, like, oh, look, Ohio State beat Penn State. And it's like, yeah, they beat them every single year.
Yes.
Right? Like, you put, I don't know, like, put a Auburn versus Georgia or an Alabama for the last 15 years. You know what I mean? Like, are we hyping up Auburn every single year just to, like, make Georgia and Alabama's schedule look better? Like,
no.
Yeah, they don't apply the same logic. That's why I hate the fact that we do these rankings from the very beginning of the season all the way, because it just creates this dumb bias. Because if you didn't have any rankings, Penn State plays nobody outside of Ohio State and Michigan, and those are their same 2 losses every year, but you didn't have rankings to tell you that you thought Penn State was good, you would look at these games and go, Penn State's not a good football team. Like,
well,
and then it wouldn't make Ohio State or Michigan's schedule look that good.
It's what you talked about at the beginning. Like, I think the only way to truly solve this problem is for conferences that play interconference games. Like, you need to see Penn State go play LSU. Because and the problem is it happens sort of like it did last year against Utah. It's like they almost like validated Penn State last year because they beat Utah. Now, Utah loses Cam Rising. So, and a bowl game is such a terrible way to sort of judge a team outside of the playoffs. Like
especially nowadays, the amount of people that are skipping out on bowl games, and there's 100,000 bowl games anyway. Like bowl games are not a way to judge interconference play.
Correct. And if the rankings were actually true. Like guys, some teams are just not going to show up for a bowl game. Like, I'm sorry, but your bigger schools that just barely missed out on the playoffs usually don't show up because it's like, that's not what we were playing the season for to end up in a Liberty Bowl.
Dude, last year's CFP, Ohio State. If
Smith and Jigba played
if
in
he
that game,
plays,
they
probably beat Georgia, right?
100%.
And like, it's not even just like mediocre bowl games. That was for a national championship, or at least a shot at a national championship. And my man just made a business decision and was like, not worth it. I'm going pro. Which, fine, that's his decision, but like that's why you can't judge bowl games on that kind of stuff.
Which you were talking about something earlier, which you were talking about sort of how it's a wash after the top 10. What it really is and I'm so glad it worked out this week as it did, because I think it's going to put some stuff into mind. What it really is it's how the committee, they put teams into certain positions to then justify the resume of the teams up top. And a prime one,
Kansas.
Oh, dude, Texas. Like, when you look at them, you got Kansas and Oklahoma State. So they were all above Oklahoma, who Texas lost to. But then Oklahoma State got sent into orbit by Central Florida. Like, I mean,
who beat Oklahoma?
Who just, yes, and literally laid it. I mean, UCF is like a 5-5 team right now. Like, they are not good. Like, and it wasn't just like, hey, they barely squeaked one out. They beat them 45-3. Like, I mean, Oklahoma State, there's no way that if the committee puts them into the top 25 this week, like, there's no way. If they do that, all that's saying is like, we have to have some more Big 12 teams in there to justify, like.
They're using it to make their guys that they want in there, like Texas. They have to have some type of strength of schedule, so they've got to keep those rankings in there.
And because Texas Tech was 4-4. Like, that was a bad football team. Kansas was not supposed to lose. You're the number 16 team in the nation. You have no business losing to Texas Tech, and you lost. Both of those teams should fall out of the top 25. And when that happens, then Texas, now it's still a great win for them. Their only win is Alabama.
Yeah.
And so when it comes, I guess we can get into this now.
Let's talk about it now. Like, the what-if scenarios.
The what-if. So the biggest scenario, Michigan, Ohio State both play one another undefeated. Whoever wins that game is in.
I think we agree on that. I think most people would agree on that.
Florida State wins out. They're in. ACC undefeated champion. Washington wins out. You would argue they should be in, undefeated Pac-12 champion.
We'll talk about it.
So then Bama beats Georgia in the SEC championship. So you've got a one-loss Alabama, a one-loss Georgia, and then Texas wins the Big 12 with the one loss, to Oklahoma.
Yeah. Who should go?
Who should go in that fourth spot? Herb Street came on and said that if that exact scenario happens, Texas is in because of the head-to-head win, which I think from some type of logic standpoint, maybe he's right. Now, I would sit back and argue, if you look at the schedules of who these teams have played and how you justify other teams' rankings, there's no way that you can't put Bama in there.
So if you put Bama in there, though, you have to put Texas in there. Texas beat Bama, right?
It would be
that's the logic that Herb Street's
saying that one game determines who gets it because both teams have one loss. I would sit back and go, I get that there's a head-to-head. The head-to-head is not supposed to be the end-all be-all. I just look at it from like a standpoint of like, how did this early in the season, it was sort of like why we formed a committee. That was like the whole point of this. Is like, you're supposed to look at the body of work and go, where are these teams now? Like, who are the best teams in college football? And also what happened for the rest of the season. Like, Bama chose to play a non-conference game. Georgia didn't. Ohio State played Notre Dame. Florida State played LSU. Washington, I think they played Michigan State. Not really a great team to play, but it's like, are you going to... Now, your scenario is...
Well, who do you put in that situation?
I put in Bama because...
But then you leave Georgia out?
Yes.
So do you have Texas in there, though?
No.
So
I think it's
you think the head-to-head matters when it's Alabama versus Georgia, but the head-to-head doesn't matter when it's Alabama versus Texas?
It's the schedule overall. Like, I think that when you look, like, yes, Texas beat Alabama, but then you look at Texas's resume outside of the Bama game, and it's like it was nice that you played one good team, but then for the rest of the year, you did struggle. You won. Don't get me wrong. You won some games, but it's hard to sit back and not go, look, throughout the year, Bama had to play LSU. They had to play Ole Miss. They had to play Georgia. Like, they had to play Georgia in Atlanta. Like, you played, because I think at the end of tomorrow.
So you think?
I think Georgia's the number one team tomorrow.
Texas's loss to Oklahoma
is worse than the loss.
And then, so you think Texas's loss to Oklahoma is worse than Alabama's loss to Texas?
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's such a, but that's sort of like where the committee is supposed to be. Now, your argument
this is why, though, this is the exact reason why I don't like the committee, because this kind of stuff happens and it doesn't make any sense. In my opinion, now this is the tricky part, and I get it. Right now, it's tricky. When everything is kind of jumbled and there's chaos like this, there's 5 conferences and there's only 4 spots. And in my opinion, because, again, this is how the NFL works. This is how any other sport works. The college football is the only sport that does it this way, where they do like everybody says,
subjective.
It's the eyeball test. BS. Because you haven't watched that team and that team at a consistent enough rate against consistent or similar opponents to even compare them eyeball. It's just what you think and feel or what bias you have. Again, those Ohio State homers, right? So, like, in my opinion, it should be conference champions, and that's it. And I'll go back to this last year. Like, people are like, oh, TCU shouldn't even have been in there. I agree, because they lost to Kansas State. If anything, you should have put Kansas State in there because they were the Big 12 champion. But then they're like, oh, well, it was a terrible national championship game because TCU didn't belong. I'm sorry. They beat Michigan. Like, I don't care.
Well, Connor didn't get the signals for TCU.
Yeah, that's what it was. I don't care who you think is better. It does not matter what 20 people sitting in a room thinks is better. It does not matter what anybody thinks happens. That is not why we play sports. If the best team always won the game, we wouldn't even play it. You play it because that's the whole point, right? So you need to win your conference in order to get in. So in my scenario, if Bama beats Georgia, Bama is in because they're the SEC championship. And again, because of the way that the conference, the committee does it, there is no chance that they leave the SEC champion out of the CFP. There's just zero chance, right? Okay. So then you have Bama, you have the winner of Ohio State, Michigan, you have probably Florida State, and then there's one other spot. That could go to Washington if they're the undefeated Pac-12 champ, or Texas, the not undefeated but Big 12 champ. In my opinion, they should put Washington in because they're undefeated. They've played more ranked opponents. Now, they might not have as good of win as Alabama in that scenario. They've beaten Oregon now twice, so you could make an argument there. But Washington's undefeated Pac-12 championship, they should be in. If that scenario played out, I would give it a less than 1% shot that they actually put Washington in. I think they leave Washington out. And honestly, if you really want my opinion, what I think they would do is put Georgia in over both Washington and Texas. It would be Bama, not necessarily in this order, but it would be Bama, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, and Florida State. I would bet $1,000 on that.
Which I would be here for, because I love the it's not just about like one of our teams getting in. It is the chaos. Like, I enjoy the chaos. I enjoy watching these teams struggle.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think that's how it should work, right? If Georgia loses to Bama, I mean, sorry. Like, I get it. You're going to say, oh, the SEC's harder. We had to play all these. Sorry. That's the conference you play in, right? Like, look, I mean, the NFL does that all the time, right? Like, you've got the AFC North, where every single team is above 500. And the Bengals, who are on a great run, and some people are talking about like they're going to be the best team in football, who are last place in the AFC North.
And then you get the NFC South.
And then, yeah, right. Like, and it's just like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't know what else to tell you, but that's the conference you play in. So either show up and win and be as good as you think everybody says you are, or shut up and take the L.
and I will say this, I would not be mad to see Texas in before Bama because at the end of the day, Texas did what they needed to do, and Texas went in the Tuscaloosa and beat Alabama. You can't argue that stat. That's why I think every Bama fan from here to Kingdom Come is just hoping Texas drops one more game. Because if they drop another game, it's done as long as Bama does their job and wins out.
Sure.
The thing I sit back and we were talking about this earlier. This is it's like, where do we go? You're getting the 12 team. Do I think that really changes anything? No. Like, I think it makes it worse. Like,
well, I think it makes it better from the stance of like those top 4, right? We're basically getting rid of a conference. Pac-12's gone, right?
Yeah.
So now you get conference champions who are immediately in, and that's how it should be. Everything else, again, that's not how the NFL does it, right? Wild card is still based on rank, or like your actual record, but everything else is now subjective, and I think that's fine, right? Like, I think that's okay.
But this will lead, I guarantee you, it will eventually lead to the exact scenario that you talked about. That you have a 2 or 3 loss Power 5 team that people are like, hey, they played some tougher opponents, and then you have this undefeated Tulane, you got undefeated Air Force.
It's perfect, though. That's exactly what we all want to see, because all I can think about in my mind is Boise State, Oklahoma.
Well, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the committee leaves them out.
Oh.
Like, that's what I'm talking about. Like, when you take a look at, like, that next few rankings, like, if you think that the 12-team playoff is going to solve everything, it's not. It's still, like, it's funny. You were like, hey, we should just not talk about this to the end. Well, we wouldn't have podcasts because they wouldn't create drama for us to, like, it's drama TV. Like, I feel like they purposely do this to just get people, what would happen to this ranking? Just because people, just like me and you were like, no, it should be like this. Like, people get upset about it. I was telling you this earlier. This is my idea for a committee. I'll never get it published. Maybe it will go viral. Who knows? 15, however many people, I think it's a 12 or 15 person committee. These people are represented by the last 15 individual teams that are not the same team to win a national championship. So you'd have Bama, you'd have Georgia, you have LSU, Clemson, Florida State, Ohio State. I think the last one, if you went through that order, is like Miami. Whoever the last team is, that's the head of the committee. And that team is not represented by an administrative person. They have to take a person that played on that team, not present day, but like is a Bama football player or a Georgia football player, and that is the person who represents that school. Now, you'd sit back and go, well, you'd have Florida, you'd have all these SEC schools. And as I told you, if you think that, like, if Tim Tebow was there representing Florida, that he's like, I think we should give the edge to Bama. There would be no one that hated it more.
He's going to be looking for reasons to keep Bama out of it.
Yeah. Like, if you think that these opposing, and that's the beauty thing of it that I think is, like, they hate their own conference.
Yeah.
Like, they're not the guys to be arguing. Like, Ohio State's never going to be sitting there like, I really think Michigan's got
a strong schedule.
Like, they're going to be arguing against, like, which I think would be great. Because right now, like, you've never heard about, hey, it was sort of a violent meeting. Like, you've never heard that. People would be arrested.
Security would have to be in every single meeting to keep people apart from going at each other's throats.
Yeah, they'd be like, the number 12 team, like, there were punches thrown in the committee. They had to go in there with mops to clean up the blood because, like, people were losing.
In the latest committee meeting, Bo Jackson suplexed Tim Tebow. Dude, only 3 bones were broken this time, so it was a good outcome.
Yeah, like, I sit back and look at that, and I think that's where a lot of people, like, get upset about the committee is, like, it is administration. Like, it is people that they don't view it as, like, is this team better? It's like,
there's, like, business decisions or like entertainment decisions being discussed. We think they did that last year, right? When Michigan beat Ohio State, and they knew they were going to have to probably put Ohio State back into the CFP because of the way everything played out. We all kind of knew it should have been a rematch then and there of the game.
Yep.
But the committee, and I think they openly said that, like, they wanted Ohio State to earn the rematch with Michigan. So they had to go through Georgia first in order to even get there. And that's what ended up playing out to this. Everybody's everybody was complaining about TCU, right? TCU wasn't the problem. It wasn't TCU's fault that they beat Michigan in the CFP. You know what I mean? Like,
correct. It was one of those ones that after the national championship, you go, if they had ranked it like they should have, we would have never seen that because we would have seen Georgia beat the brakes off of TCU.
Yeah, that would have been the first game, and it would have been like, yeah, Georgia's in.
And then we would have watched whoever came out of the rematch of the game.
Yeah.
I just sit back and I look at the rankings. Like, for me, this week's going to be interesting. I sort of alluded to earlier. I said it. I think the committee has no choice but to put Georgia number 1.
I agree. But, I mean, being the number 2 team and then just played 2 top 10 or top 15 teams, again, we kind of thought Georgia's schedule has been weak, but, again, they've shown up and they've beaten these teams. And, like, Ole Miss, I thought was going to give them a way bigger, challenge than they did. So, like you said, I think they have no choice but to give Georgia the nod there.
And this is why I say it'll be so interesting to see what they do with Penn State in this scenario. Like, because when you look at Penn State's schedule, the only team that they've played that even just in the committee's rankings is Iowa. That's it. Like, they haven't played anyone else. So
I'm more interested to how they rank Michigan, Ohio State, because up until this point, the only reason I could say that Ohio State's better than Michigan is because they hadn't necessarily played a common opponent. Michigan now has that common opponent against Ohio State, and
they had to go to Penn State to beat them,
and they beat them more than Ohio State beat them by. Like, they played a better game and looked more dominant against Penn State than Ohio State did.
My dad called me, and I was driving to the hotel, and he was like, "Hey, I just watched the Michigan." I was like, "What'd you think?" And he was like, "Michigan's got one of those lines right now that he's like, it's probably the best line in all of college football." He's like, "You watch the line of scrimmage against," he's like, "they were just mowing guys over."
They kind of looked like that last year. Like, legitimately, I thought coming in, obviously I thought Caleb Williams was just going to repeat because of how generationally talented that guy is. But other than that, like, I thought Blake Corum was going to be a Heisman guy just because of how good that offensive line was.
What's funny,
and how good he looked at the end of last year.
We brought up Desmond Howard. That's what my dad referenced. He's like, it looked like an old 90s Michigan team. Yeah. Like, just like a run it. Like, we're going to run it eight straight times, and we're going to score, and there's nothing you can do about it because he's like, they could have lined up against Michigan and ran it or against Penn State, ran it every play and won the game.
Yeah.
He's like, that's how dominant they were. But it brings up a good point. That's what the committee's supposed to look at. Now that they're the only team that they've played that's ranked by the committee, because Notre Dame's not getting in, is going to be Penn State. I think my logic says Penn State is still top 15. That's what I think they do with them. I don't think that's the way it should be because I don't think that Penn State has played anyone. So I still think that Notre Dame's still sitting at 20. So I guess Notre Dame will still be in.
Which how are they still 20 after they lost to Clemson?
The only team
4-4 Clemson.
Yes, and the only team Notre Dame has beat is
USC.
Duke. And USC,
yeah.
But USC's not ranked. Like,
yeah, true.
Both schools that you use to validate Notre Dame's ranking because really now that Duke looks the way Duke looks, you sit back and go, the only reason Duke got any hype is because Duke beat Clemson.
Yeah, which again, back to my why we shouldn't have these rankings, because if Duke beats Clemson and then Clemson has this type of season and they're 4-4 or whatever they are, you look back and go, well, Duke's win wasn't actually that good because Clemson wasn't good.
Correct.
They don't use that logic though with other teams.
Correct. They don't.
Or they, like you said, they purposely, when a team loses, they won't drop them as low as they should have if it was a different team in order to keep those rankings higher. Which is another reason why I do think they have Ohio State and Michigan both way up there. And they do this intentionally because they know they have to play each other, right? Like, it's totally valid for them right now because they go, well, one of them's got to win, right? So now I go, if whoever wins, does that just boost Washington up into the number 4 rankings when whichever team loses falls out? Or do they do that intentionally to try to keep them both in there?
Well, we weren't doing the podcast last season, but I think this was the big argument that came out last season, that if it was Michigan that lost to Ohio State, would have Michigan have gotten the nod to go face
like
Georgia?
Ohio State did? Probably not.
There's no way. Like, Michigan's only path to get into the CFP every year is they have to be undefeated.
Yeah.
Like if Michigan loses a game, Michigan's not getting in. But like Michigan has, it's been proven, like Michigan has lost one game during the season that they shouldn't have lost, and it's like the committee's like, we're done with Michigan.
They do that with all the other teams too.
Ohio State will lose like a bad one, and people are still like, well,
which brings up another conspiracy theory with this whole Michigan garbage going on. Like, do we think that if the roles were flipped, like if this was Ohio State that was under investigation, but you can't prove anything kind of deal, you think they're suspending
Ryan
Day?
Well, let's get into that. So for those of you who don't know, the whole sign stealing, which I find funny that we're even investigating this. It's like, hey, you know what you should do? You should change your signs.
Yeah, have a better sign system. Or let's, again, leave it to the NCAA to screw things up. Let's get some tech going on. This is 2023. Put some freaking microphones in the helmets. Everybody's got that nowadays.
Said that.
Just do that.
Yes.
That way you don't have these stupid signs up on the field. And again, if you're going to put your sign out there for somebody to read, don't get mad at me for decoding it.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Like
that goes. Every single institution around the world does exactly that, but we're mad at Michigan. But to get back to the Harbaugh, so the Big Ten sends a letter to Michigan that literally the very first line, and you go ahead and I want to read this verbatim because it makes me so mad.
I also just think the timing of it is very suspicious, right? Like you're gonna send this and kick out the head coach when right before ultimately Michigan's biggest game of the season at this point. Right before that game, you're going to suspend the head coach. And again, the conspiracy is that they wanted Michigan to lose, right? Like the committee wants an easy path to keep the teams that they want in. And that's Ohio State to them all the time. It's never Michigan. It's always Ohio State. Because you said it. Like the only way Michigan gets there is by going undefeated. So they want Michigan to lose to make it an easy decision to just go, we don't have any chaos. Michigan's out. Ohio State gets to stay.
So here's the opening sentence of this. It was a 13-page letter. We impose this disciplinary action even though the conference has not yet received any information indicating that head football coach Jim Harbaugh was aware of the impermissible nature of the sign stealing scheme. This is not a sanction of Coach Harbaugh. It is a sanction against the university that under extraordinary circumstances presented by this offensive conduct best benefits the violation because, and they list a few things. But like you said, if the tables were, like they literally submitted this on a holiday weekend knowing that it could not go before judge because the court's on recess for the holiday. Like if you, and I'll change it up between Ohio State. If you think Georgia filed this against Alabama, that you think that they're not dragging some federal judge out of his home to be like, you're making a ruling on this or we'll
burn your house down.
Yeah, we'll burn your house. Like they would, it is unreal that this happened. And the fact that it's not against Coach Harbaugh, it's against a university. And it goes back to the same way that how the NCAA runs things. And it's the dumbest thing in the world. When Tom Brady did the Deflategate, what did they do? They just suspended him the next year. At no point was the NFL dumb enough to be like, hey, that Super Bowl
we're going to vacate your wins and your MVPs and stuff. Get real. That doesn't happen.
They don't do it because they understand that, you know what happened? At the end of the day, these teams played one another. If you thought your signs were being stolen, you know what you do? You change them up, which it's funny. It's like overblown the fact that there's also stuff going into it that it says that Rutgers and Ohio State both in another team were colluding to take signs on Michigan, and they were trading information about it. Like,
Matt Rule said it. Because they asked him about it. He was like, everybody does it. Like, it's part of the game. Like,
yes, it's why you have 4 guys over there doing different
if you're going to
signals.
put your signs out there, people are going to try to steal them. That's part of the game. That's literally how you play the game. If you don't like it, either change the rules, get better technology, or just like deal with the fact that like they know what play you're going to run. Like, I don't know, switch it up. Like, have you seen The Imitation Game, the movie?
Yes, it's amazing.
Like, right? Like, you don't think the Nazis came out and were like, oh, well, the Americans figured out our sign, so they shouldn't be allowed to win this war. That I'm sorry. That's how you play the game, dude. Like, get a better sign if you want that. You know what I mean? Like, it drives me nuts.
And so the fact that they did this, I just sit back and it's one of these. This is where this, like, the reason I said at the beginning, like, Ohio State always gets the benefit of the doubt. And like you said, it just seems like the committee has always looked at Ohio State and like, well, that's our team. Like,
because again, if this was an SEC thing, like because I don't think the SEC has favorites outside of Georgia and Alabama, right? Like they love those two guys because they've been winning. But if this came out and it was between those two teams, you know what the SEC would do? They would go, we'll look into this after the season.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's probably how it should have happened, right? Now, if they had like hard, blatant evidence that were like, you did this, I got it. But when they start off with the letter of like, we have no evidence, but we're so spineless, we're gonna just do this anyway. Get real.
What's why? I mean, I hate like Paul Feinbaum and these. When I say hate, I mean not just. It's more their sports takes. It's not them as a person. It's the fact that they get on and they're like, Michigan needs to be, they should be kicked out of the college football play. And and this is another thing, like when you get to the rankings and you understand how this all works, there was a guy that said, I will not vote for Michigan's quarterback because of this stuff, like for the Heisman.
Yeah.
And it's like, how does that play any fact?
Yeah.
Like I remember there was a dude in the NFL,
the MVP Aaron Rodgers thing.
He's like, I'm not going to vote for Aaron Rodgers because he didn't get the COVID vaccine. That dude should immediately be banned from any type of sports commentary for the rest of his entire life.
You're no longer entitled to an opinion.
Yes, you're done. And that's the exact same thing happened right now. It's like they should not have an opinion on what's going on. Like this, if it is a legal matter and it's like a crime, then you know what? You let the judicial courts handle it. You are innocent until proven guilty of, and that's the whole thing. That's like why I'm mad about it. It's like the Big Ten did this right before Michigan had to go to Penn State to play at Penn State. They purposely chose this time on a federal holiday to make it so they couldn't argue about it, even though they had no proof. This whole, like, you're innocent until proven guilty, any of that completely out the window.
Dude. Yeah.
Yeah. And why? Because, like, if you think that this would have happened against Ohio State, I 100% guarantee you that it would not have happened. Like, at no point would they have treated Ohio State just like they're treating Michigan right now.
No chance.
No chance. No chance. Like, and then it's coming out that like Ohio State's like Ryan Day was pretty much paying for this investigation. Like Ohio State was the one that was looking, which it's funny. You can't beat them. So what do? You try to get them disqualified.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, like it goes, NCAA has been doing this since the beginning, like paying players or like giving players benefits. I mean, they've been doing that since the beginning of time. It's just they come out and decide to punish certain schools during their heyday or right after their heyday in order to punish people that had no business doing it. And now what? We got NIL deals. You know what I mean? Like, so what's going to come out of this one? Like better signs so that they can't get stolen, or maybe they put communication. Like they're going to change the rules eventually. Again, the NCAA always finds the worst possible solution to screw things up or make it where it doesn't make any sense, or their clear bias is showing.
I think that I never really heard anyone put it that way, and now that you said it, it's so true. It just like gets me thinking that you have this $1 billion industry of playing college football, and at the end of the day, it's subjective of who gets in. And when you look at all professional sports, there is no subjectivity.
Because it introduces too much of this.
Yes.
Like, that's not why sports are played.
It should be about who you played, when you won, who you won, what's your schedule. Like, there should be some time. And at the end of the day, you know what? Like, that's why I'm in favor of just like the BCS. Like, at least the computer, it was like you had this ranking, this algorithm. There was no human factor in it whatsoever. You took it out of it, and what the computer scored, that's what the computer scored. Like, sorry, you didn't like it? Well, you should have won by more. Yeah. Like, tough. Like, I'm sure there's a website that would tell you. It will be, like you said, to get back onto like the rankings, it will be very interesting to me that if Georgia's number one, which I think they should be, if Georgia's not number one and Ohio State remains number one, whole different like ball game of like problems. Because I don't think that Ohio State has a leg to stand on based upon what you just talked about. Like with Georgia, they just beat the number 9 team in the country. They've got to win over the number 14 team from last week. Those are going to change. Missouri's going to probably get a bump up. Ole Miss is going to fall down.
I'll kind of with your Penn State, I'm interested to see what they do with Tennessee, because they just lost to Missouri, which now Tennessee has 2 losses?
3
losses now?
Missouri, Alabama, and the really bad one, Florida.
Yeah, right? So what happens to Tennessee? They've got 3 losses. Do they fall out of the top 25? No way. No way, because
I would argue
who are they playing next week?
Georgia.
They've got to keep them in the rankings to continue to boost Georgia's schedule.
Yes, but they don't want to be a threat to Georgia.
But they're not going to be because
of this. Like, we talked about this. I found it humorous that Georgia, on the road this year, Georgia has played absolutely no one. Like, they've gotten their schedule at home. They had to play, against Florida, which is in Jacksonville. You could argue that's a road game. I don't really see it as a road game just because, like, it's Jacksonville. Like, it's.
Well, who was their biggest threat so far?
Their biggest threat was Missouri.
Ole Miss.
Ole Miss and Missouri, both of which they played at home. Their road games this year at Auburn, which was that was like an 11 o'clock game or a 3:30 game, at Vanderbilt. Then they've played Florida, Mizzou, and Ole Miss at home, and now they go to Tennessee.
And the Ole Miss game was under the lights.
That's what I found humorous. It's like, of course, when Georgia has their biggest threat, which is against Ole Miss, what happens? They get them at Sanford Stadium under the lights when it's going to be the loudest. Like, Ole Miss had and I'm not saying that Ole Miss would have won the game if it's an 11 o'clock game, but it is a different atmosphere.
Yeah.
Like, it's completely different. Completely different. The fact that now Georgia, their toughest road game, which I've said all year was going to be at Tennessee, and I get that Tennessee's not the same Tennessee from last year. They have 3 losses. The fact that it is not a 7:30 game at Neyland Stadium, it's a 3:30 kickoff. Like, that completely changes the game.
And you think that's by coincidence?
No.
Like, there's a reason they do those TBD games, because they have to wait until things kind of play out and the committee can go, or the NCAA can go, all right, do we want chaos at this point or do we not want chaos at this point? TBD, Tennessee's not that good. We don't want Georgia to lose now because that's going to throw a wrench in things. Let's give it to them at noon.
And for anyone,
or 3:30 or whatever it is.
If anyone sits back and they go, well, that's because they're going to play another SEC game that's better. Who's the SEC game that's in prime time at 7:30 at night? Florida at Missouri. Like, an unranked school that's not good. Florida is terrible this year going and playing Missouri. And you sit back and you look at that and you go, the game of the week is Georgia going to Tennessee. Like, it is the highest threat Georgia has before playing Alabama in the SEC championship. That game, Georgia should have a test at night against an opponent like Tennessee, even though they're not good. But it's just like you said, they sit back and they go, look, we can't have this messed up, so we're not going to have it messed up. They're not going to play at night under Neyland.
We've seen it in every conference throughout. I mean, like, anytime you get – they don't even have to be both ranked. It's anytime there's a little bit of a rivalry in conference and you get that primetime game, like, things can happen. Happens every single year. But, again, they find ways to make it so that it puts in favor of their – Cinderellas, or the people that they love, their darlings. It gives them the benefit of the doubt all the time.
Which I would argue the same thing happened. As much as we just said Michigan gets hated on a lot, I was actually very surprised that it was an 11 o'clock kickoff against Penn State and that it wasn't at night in Penn State for the game. Now, the only reason I don't think it was is because they announced the game before they announced the punishment. If the punishment had been announced, there's no doubt in my mind that Michigan would have had to go into Beaver Stadium at night against a whiteout. But it didn't happen. So, yes, it'll be so interesting to see how Ohio State, Michigan are ranked. And then I do think that you have to sit back and argue something. And so we were talking about this earlier. You got Florida State, Washington, then Oregon. I sit back, and the USC game to me told me more about, like, before the game, if you had told me, how do you think USC plays Oregon, I would say Oregon is going to curb stomp them like they did Utah. Like, it's going to be ugly. And USC was in that game. Like, I get that they got down by a few scores, but they're at the end, it's a one-score game. The fourth quarter, you had the feeling like USC can win this game. Like,
they've been in that.
And they were in that against Washington. Like, same thing. USC had a chance to win both of those games. And you sit back and I just sort of look at that and I go, man, I thought it spoke more to about, I don't think Oregon's as good as everyone sort of gives Oregon credit for being. And I get they blew out Utah, which is a big win for them. But yet again, Utah, in my opinion, isn't as good as everyone like.
Well, they're a different team without Cam Rising,
Yes.
and they've been kind of that, up or down with Bryson Barnes.
They've had really good wins, but they've also had some bad losses.
Yeah.
Like they're very inconsistent.
Yep.
And I would put a lot of that because they don't have Cam Rising. Yeah. You sit back and you look at how do they rank these three teams? Like Florida State, yes, beat LSU, but they have had some struggles against They had a struggle against Clemson. Should have probably lost that game. Against Miami. Like, Miami had chances. It's just the fact that, like, Miami's still Miami. Like, they just don't have the talent they had from the early 2000s.
Yeah, they can't quite finish. They can't put it all together at the same time.
100%. Like, I'm interested to see. I think that if Oregon had beat USC handedly, that Oregon jumps Washington. Like, it seems so close right now that they want to like flip some of these.
I think they're kind of in the same boat that Ohio State Michigan is. It's just they're the Ohio State Michigan outside of the top four right now. Like, they kind of know those two teams are going to play each other again, and it'll really throw in some chaos. And it's not that I like one team more than the other. I hope Washington just wins again, though, because that way it gives a clear, definitive, undefeated Pac-12 champion. Because if somehow Oregon wins, I think, again, the committee just goes, oh, thank God, they're both out. We don't have to think about them. They're both out. Texas is going to jump both of them.
What hurts Oregon, too, like in that, it hurts the Pac-12. And I said this to you earlier, and you had the best response, which was, welcome to my life, is – it was 1 a.m. in the morning, and I'm staying up to watch this Oregon-USC game. Like, and
those West Coast games are tough.
Dude, like, you living on the East Coast, you're just sitting there, you're like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Like, it's it's midnight. Like, what are we doing? Like, put this game on at like 7 p.m.
Because they're good games. Like, they need to be in prime time, not these, and I get it. It's prime time for the West Coast, but like, 80% of the country, it's not prime time for. Like, get some viewers and eyeballs on that game, and, maybe rankings are different.
And it's why they left. Like, you can be mad at the whole super conference thing. This is why they left, because I can guarantee you this, that when Oregon plays Michigan and it's at Oregon, I can promise you it will never be a 10 p.m. kickoff.
Yeah.
Ever. Oregon will go play Rutgers or Northwestern at 10 p.m. on the West Coast. In that game, you can stay up and watch. But they will never have the big names of the new Big Ten kick off at 10 p.m. on the West Coast. Yeah. Like, it's or 10 p.m. on the East Coast. Like, it's never going to happen. Never. After that, I mean, we've talked about the Texas, Alabama. That, to me, it just goes back to, I get we have the SEC bias. I'm not going to argue against that. It's there. It's prevalent. It is going to be a factor. The scenario of how it could go down, that's the thing I'm most excited for. Because I wish I wasn't an Alabama fan just to be able to say it. Like, I just look at how Alabama's won games, and I sit back and go, hey, they're playing good opponents. My bigger argument is like when I take a look at Oregon, I would almost rather see Oregon come after Alabama and Texas, just because like Oregon outside of beating Utah really doesn't have a good win. Like, they lost to Washington. Like, Why is Oregon above Texas and Alabama? And that's sort of where, for me, the committee, this one-loss ranking teams, like, I'm struggling with them putting Oregon at 6, which I think is sort of, Zach, what you alluded to, it's sort of the big, they don't want Oregon to be below Bama and Washington, and then Oregon beat Washington, because then it's like, well, what do we now do? Yeah. Because if Bama beats Georgia, like you said, I don't see us. That's why I said I think Bama should get in. It's because I don't see the committee leaving out. If Bama beats Georgia, Bama's in.
100%. Like, I'm not disagreeing with that. But I also think, I really do think, if that does happen, I still think they leave Georgia in. And we'll see. I mean, we'll see. It depends on how the rest of it plays out, right? Like, this is where it's like, I like chaos, but it's the same time, I only like enough chaos because if there's so much chaos that everybody's kind of meh, you end up with these exact same rankings, and they're just going to go, oh, well, we still think Georgia's better. And again, this is that SEC bias, and I get it. Alabama won the national championship that year. So, but again, I go back to it's not about just putting the best team in always, right? But when you have so much chaos that they're allowed to just go, well, we think Bama's a better team, even though they didn't even play in their conference championship, let alone not win it, we're still going to put them in. I hate that. I would rather see the TCUs have the shot at it. Not saying that any of these teams are TCUs, but like I want just enough chaos that it mixes up who those teams are, but not so much that they're allowed to just go completely eyeball test and put whoever they think is going to win.
The only thing I keep wanting to like hammer you on this because I think that's like I wish that we could like close our eyes and forget that Bama was the next team out. Like it's not about that. It's about the fact that TCU, I think that throughout that year, you saw multiple games that TCU should have lost. Like, had every business of losing. They were able to sneak out wins. And I think everyone sort of knew, like, man, TCU's like on life support. They're just going, and they caught the wrong opponent in the Big 12 championship game. So they didn't win their conference. So when you, like, remove it and you say, hey, you have a team that lost, didn't win their conference against, in my opinion, a Kansas State team that wasn't a good football team. That's where the subjectivity, and that's where I hate it, because I would rather just go to a system that said, the computer ranks these variables like this and then let it do it. Because the second that, like, you understand that, like, if the committee truly wanted to be transparent, they'd have cameras in there. Like, it'd be like anytime the congressional hearings, like, are like, hey, it's behind closed doors, you're like, something's going on that I ain't liking.
Yeah.
Like,
well, so the problem with the computer thing, and again, I'm more towards that than the way it is. The problem with that, though, is there's still the human bias of somebody's got to program that to say who's a stronger strength of schedule. And that was the BCS. The BCS and the SEC and ESPN were all in collusion with each other.
Well,
where they said, if you play in the SEC, just by the nature of being in that conference, you have a harder strength of schedule.
Well, the computer had a hard time doing exactly what we're doing right now, which is, well, this team was ranked number 6 when you played them. Like, the computer had, which I get it, it was a programming thing that someone said you can't ignore the fact that when they played them, they were the number 6, regardless how the rest of the season went. Like,
but so again, I go back to, like, this is how the NFL does it. The Vikings last year. The Vikings were breaking records as far as like how bad they were, but still having the best record, right? We all thought they were pretenders. We kind of knew that they were pretenders. Don't get me wrong. It was a special season to watch, and it was fun to watch. But like at the same time, it was like, dude, these guys aren't for real. But guess what? They won games. And at the end of the day, that's all that mattered. So they won their conference. Guess what? They got to the playoffs. And they know what happened?
they lost.
They lost. First round. And that's how it should go. That's why sports happen, right? Like, at the end of the day, if you don't like it, win the games. You know what I mean? And I'm with you. I don't think TCU should have been in. I really don't. Now, they beat Michigan, so I was like, oh, look, maybe they should be in. But they shouldn't have been in there because they weren't the best team and they didn't win their conference. But that's not to say, oh, well, if TCU shouldn't be in there, then Bama should be. Bama didn't win their conference either.
100%.
So I mean, that's my argument.
I get that it was Saban that said it, and it's not so much me arguing for Bama. It's more just like he was using the committee's own logic against him, which is the committee said that if you put Bama and TCU on the same field, that Bama would win.
Yeah.
And so Saban's like, well, then why are we not in there?
Exactly.
Like, you said that you were going to put the best 4 teams in football in there. You didn't follow by the standards that you set.
Which goes back to why this committee is so bad, is that they don't even follow their own rules that they say they're doing.
Yes, and that's why we're mad. Like, if there was any way to, like, bow tie this episode, it is that when you don't follow your own standards, like, if I came on and I was like, hey, we're going to talk about college football this episode, and then all I did talk about NFL, you'd be like, what are you guys talking about? Like,
all you got to do is win your conference to make it. Hey, you won your conference? Yeah, but we don't really like you, so you're not in. What? I'm sorry. You laid out the rules. We did exactly what we're supposed to do, and then you left us out because some eyeball test.
Yes.
Like, it's ridiculous.
That, to me, and that's where, like, this, so where do you, here, we'll sort of end it like this. What do you think the rankings should be, and what do you think the rankings will be come Tuesday night, tomorrow night?
I think the rankings should be Georgia, Michigan, Washington, Florida State, Ohio State, Texas.
Okay. So that'd be your top 6.
I think the rankings will be Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, Florida State, Washington, Oregon. I think the only 2 teams that flip are Georgia and Ohio State.
So I'm going to go conspiracy theory, and this is what else. I think the ranking should look very similar. I think it should be Georgia number 1, Michigan number 2. I don't have a problem with that. I like Washington more because of who they've had to play. I think Washington should be 3, Florida State 4, then Ohio State. That's just me. Michigan, to me, has the best body of work. Like,
isn't that what I said? What did I say?
I
thought it was Georgia, Michigan. Did I say Florida State, Washington?
think you said Florida State,
Okay,
Washington.
I like Washington, Florida State.
Okay, Washington.
I thought that was what I said.
So we have the same top 4, and then you have Ohio State and then Texas, and I would say the exact same thing. I think that the rankings do not change.
You don't think they change at all?
I don't think they change. And it's because
I can see that.
the second that you bump Ohio State out of that, like it becomes now you have to compare Michigan, Ohio State. And when you do that, like I get that Michigan hadn't played Notre Dame, but they played a mutual opponent. They had to play them in Beaver Stadium. Like I don't see how you can sit back and not put Michigan above Ohio State. So I don't think the committee's going to argue that point now. Why? Because they'll just leave it the way that it is. Because
they know that they have to play each other. That's
like I don't see the rankings changing from that standpoint, because if it changes, then it opens up the argument of then who's better because they play this mutual opponent, Michigan or Ohio State.
You could make the argument though that now because Penn State has another loss, Ohio State's win over them isn't as good, right? Like that's some BS that the committee would use. The reason I just think again, when you're just comparing the two, I think Michigan's better than Ohio State, so I think they should be in. The reason I have Ohio State out is because even at the end of the day, if Ohio State does beat Michigan in the game, you just flip-flop those two. But as it stands right now, I think you should put the best 4 teams in those conferences in the top 4. Like that's in my opinion how, because if you want to sit back and say that those 2 teams, or because they're in the Big Ten or whatever, is better, crazy to me. Like that's crazy to me. Like the Pac-12 has looked great this season. They've been up and down and they had weird losses and all that stuff, but like they have had really good games, better than we've seen in many years with the amount of teams. Arizona being a surprise, Oregon State being a surprise. And I know those aren't like household names, but they're playing good football. Obviously, USC, the fact that USC is not even ranked because they've lost to 4 Pac-12 opponents, it's a knock on USC, but it's also a boost of like how good the Pac-12 is actually this year.
Yes.
Right? Like that's a big boost for the Pac-12.
Which this week, I mean, a little foreshadowing. This is yet again because it's the Pac-12. Like I feel like it's a slept-on game that no one wants to talk about. Oregon State has to play Washington. Like, dude, like, and I'll be the first one to say as much as I like Washington, I think they're like.
Is it in Corvallis?
I
don't know. I don't know where the game is.
We're gonna get your PTSD going.
Yeah, nighttime Corvallis.
It is nighttime, 7:30. Washington has to go play Oregon State.
Put him in the ground, dude. Yeah. It's over. Just get the tombstone ready, dude. And like this, but this is the kind of stuff that will frustrate you because the committee is praying that Oregon State wins. They're praying that they win because that just immediately eliminates Washington. When in reality, it shouldn't, right? Like you've got you're going to have all these other teams that with one loss that are in the conversation, but Washington losing to Oregon State, they're done, dude. Done. And why? Everybody thinks they're just done. Why? Because the bias that we've been taught and the fact that Pac-12 doesn't get viewed.
Correct. Which is why this is why it all hinges. Like I'll go back to it. This is why like when I take a look, I'm so interested to see what happens with Oklahoma State. They get blown out. Right now, Oklahoma State is still in the position that if Oklahoma State wins out, they'll play Texas in the Big 12 championship, even though they just got scorched earth by UCF.
It's crazy.
But if they knock them out of the top 25, what happens is now you present a possibility that these other teams that you now move into there don't lose. And so you don't have Texas playing a top 25 team in the Big 12 championship when you know that Bama and Georgia are on a warpath. The only thing that possibly upsets it, which it's sort of like your PTSD from Corvallis, every Bama fan's PTSD is going to Jordan O'Hare playing Auburn at night. Like, there is no doubt in my mind that Satan is a real thing because of what happens in that stadium at night. Like, they're praying to the devil because stuff happens in that stadium that doesn't happen anywhere else. And you sit back and you watch games, you're like, yo, y'all made a deal with the devil. I know it. Like, but I know that the committee's sitting back looking at this going, this is the matchup that's going to happen. There's no way that we can now put Texas against above Bama in the CFP if they don't play a top 25 ranking in the Big 12 championship. Like, that's what they need. So it will be very interesting to see like where the shift happens. Like, do they bump Oklahoma State and Kansas State out, or Kansas out? Like, Kansas State's going to get a bump, but from that standpoint, that would leave Texas with only one top 25 win against Kansas State. That's it. Like, that's it. Like, those are the type of things that I see going on, and but yet again, I know we just made this conspiracy. Like, it's funny to me that Washington has to go play Oregon State at night in Corvallis, but Georgia doesn't have to go play at night at Tennessee. Like, it is
because they want Georgia in the national champion or in the CFP. They don't want Washington in there. They've already got them outside the top 4. They're looking for a reason to not have them in there because they don't want them in there.
Yeah, I will say that if there was a team that I had to pick that was a sleeper to win it all, that I think it's funny. It's like we mention them, but we never talk about them. Florida State's got a good team. Like, they have really good defensive linemen. Their wide receiver core is slept on.
They have looked weak at times, but their good looks really, really good. Yeah, like if they show up and play their good state of football,
I don't know who can beat them.
Yeah, they can beat anybody.
Yes, like it's that, which I know my dad said at the beginning of the year. It's one of those types of years that, like, a team that you probably didn't think was going to win can win. Like, this is that for Florida State.
So we can finish it up with the divine intervention or weird similarities that it's hard to say it's just a coincidence.
Oh my gosh!
The first year of the CFP could technically, or I guess this last year of the CFP in its modern day, before we go to the 12 team, could end up being the same teams as the very first CFP with the same results.
And so what that is Alabama played Ohio State, which I think everyone can sit back and go, hey, that's a very real possibility.
You could easily see that playing out.
And the opposing matchup was Oregon versus Florida State.
Also, now things have to happen, but the fact that there's a path to that is a weird, strange coincidence.
And the path is Ohio State wins out, Florida State wins out. Both of those teams 1 and 2. Bama beats Georgia. Bama, due to having one loss, is sitting there. And then you have Oregon, who beats Washington, both of which are ahead. And what would the chaos that would need to happen is that Texas has to lose another game.
Well, that and the fact that they do a 1-loss Oregon, who has avenged their loss, gets in over a 1-loss Georgia.
A 1-loss Alabama.
Well, if Bama beats Georgia, they're in.
That's what I'm saying. But to create the matchup of Alabama, Ohio State number 1, Florida State number 2.
I think it's a big ask for them to put Oregon over Georgia, though, is what I'm saying. Because you would have a 1-loss Oregon, as far as who gets in, it'd be a 1-loss Oregon versus a 1-loss Georgia.
Yeah, but Oregon wins their conference.
Yeah, there's a path to it, but there's a lot of things that have to happen to get there.
If it happened, that would be pretty ironic.
That would be cool. That would be like a weird, type of you couldn't have written.
You'd be like,
story.
Was this in the script?
Yeah.
Was this how it was supposed to go down? Yeah. Like, you'd want to, you want to know. But I mean, pretty good episode. I know it's a long one, but I think covered a lot of good stuff. So before the end of it's Monday, we're going to record the NFL episode. I'll get the college one up tomorrow. So before the rankings come out, and we'll get the NFL one up on Wednesday. But I do want to thank you. Go to Instagram, TikTok, follow, subscribe. Go to our website, Football Talk Squadron. You can find our YouTube, Apple, and Spotify podcasts. Follow us on there. We appreciate all the things. So anything else before we wrap up?
Nope. Thanks for tuning in.
See you next time. Time Pull Chucks.
Peace.